Behind every prime minister, premier, cabinet minister stands an essential deputy minister, a senior civil servant. Where in that pairing does the real power lie? Joseph Heath is author, most recently, of The Machinery of Government, Public Administration and the Liberal State, and he joins us as part of our joint initiative between TVO and the Toronto Star on the democracy agenda to consider that question. Joseph, it's good to have you back on the program. How are you managing?
I've been doing okay. Thank you.
Glad to hear that. We are going to explore this relationship between the elected politicians and the civil service for real, but we thought we would just pluck a clip out of fiction to get us started because this is just too delicious to pass up. Here is from the very well-known television program Yes Minister, the British comedy show. Here is Sir Humphrey Appleby explaining how it all works to his minister's personal private secretary. Go ahead, please, Chad. Let's run that.
If it's our job to carry out government policies, shouldn't we believe in them?
What an extraordinary idea.
Why?
Bernard, I have served 11 governments in the past 30 years. If I'd believed in all their policies, I would have been passionately committed to keeping out of the common market and passionately committed to going into it. I would have been utterly convinced of the rightness of nationalizing steel and of denationalizing it and renationalizing it. In capital punishment, I'd have been a fervent retentionist and an ardent abolitionist. I would have been a Keynesian and a Friedmanite, a grammar school preserver and destroyer, a nationalization freak and a privatization maniac, but above all, I would have been a stark-staring, raving schizophrenic.
Gosh, that was a good show. How well, in your view, Joseph, does that clip sum up how civil servants are supposed to deal with their political masters?
Well, so I have to say that there's this really, really old joke in the civil service. I think that half the PowerPoints in the civil service start out with this joke that Yes Minister was a documentary and not a comedy. So there is a basic truth to it. So what Sir Humphrey there is describing is one of the most important features of the British civil service, which Canada shares with Britain, and that's the Convention of Civil Service Neutrality. And so the thought is that the civil service isn't supposed to take a position. Now, the advantage of that arrangement then is that it allows the same civil servants to remain in their positions with changes of government. Now, that's actually a huge difference between Canada and the United States. And so, when we follow American news, we always see the issue about the president trying to get Senate approval for various appointments. Because when an American president comes in, about 5,000 people lose their jobs and get directly replaced. And then probably another 40 to 50,000 people down the line lose their jobs and get replaced. So they have a partisan civil service. And in Canada, we have the same arrangement that Sir Humphrey is describing there, which is that in some cases, the new government changes and they might shuffle the deputy ministers, but no one actually loses their job. Everybody stays in position. And that, of course, gives the civil service distinctive forms of power in the British Canadian system that they don't have in the American system.
But let me just follow up on that. In theory, don't we like that about our system in as much as governments can change depending on the importance of various issues of the day, but we like to have some institutional memory in place that provides continuity as well. And presumably the dynamic between those two, tension and benefits, is a good thing for democracy, no?
Yes, it's often described as a kind of a bargain or a trade-off. And so the thing that politicians get out of it is that they get a more effective civil service. And the problem with people who come in from outside an organization is that they don't know how to get things done. And so you get a higher level of professionalism. And it's absolutely the case that in Canada, part of the reason the quality of government is high is because we have this highly professional civil service. The downside is that you don't get, from the politician's perspective, is that you don't get loyalty, and in particular, you don't have people who are personally loyal to you into those positions. Although I should mention that things have changed since Yes Minister, so it's important not to treat Yes Minister as being canonical and documentary. So one of the things about Yes Minister is that in that TV show, it was before the development of political staff. And so now politicians typically are also surrounded. I mean, there in that show, there's a single minister who's the elected official surrounded entirely by civil servants who are constantly pulling the wool over his eyes and not letting him accomplish anything and so forth. Nowadays, people have a chief of staff and they'll have a dozen people who are so-called exempt staff who are party loyalists and are not civil servants. So things have also evolved in the direction, in part because politicians are not entirely thrilled with allowing their political fortunes to rest entirely in the hands of people that they have that don't owe them anything and that have no, partisan loyalties.
Well, let me pursue this issue of partisan loyalty with you, because you're quite right. The civil service is supposed to be neutral. But we may well remember an incident, I think it was about 5.5 years ago, when Justin Trudeau first became prime minister, and he went to the Lester B. Pearson building in Ottawa to sort of make a courtesy call on the folks who were working in global affairs and say, I'm the new guy and I just want to meet you. And he got such a rock star's welcome. The cheers, the cell phones that were taking pictures, it fulfilled every skeptical conservative's view of how Ottawa works, which namely is the Liberals have stacked the civil service for years. Is that a fair charge, the way you look at it?
It's a lot of people cringed, actually. A lot of civil servants cringed with that particular episode with Justin Trudeau at Foreign Affairs. So there's a couple things about it. First of all, it's important to say that the institution of civil service neutrality, or public service neutrality, as we say in Canada, is more popular with Liberals than it is with Conservatives. That is, Conservatives often have the suspicion that their civil servants are all Liberals who are just kind of not, don't have their party cards signed, but are sort of tacitly liberal. And so there's often a lot more pressure gets put on the civil service and the institutions of neutrality with conservative governments. You saw it with the Harper government, but you can also see it really, really clearly with more conservative governments at the provincial level, where in some provinces, aspects of neutrality have been dismantled because of this concern that they're really just closet liberals. The other thing I should say about that episode with Trudeau is that civil service neutrality cuts both ways, which is that on the one hand, you're not supposed to obstruct the policies and initiatives of the government, and obstructionism is often what people worry most about. But it also is intended to preclude excessive enthusiasm for the government as well. So there are episodes where Canadian civil servants have gotten in trouble for being too loyal to the minister rather than disloyal to the minister. So it is important to keep in mind. And so that thing at Foreign Affairs, I mean, on the one hand, it showed disloyalty to the previous government, but it also showed excess of loyalty to the government of the day. And that was what caused a lot of sort of, disapproval amongst senior civil servants about that behavior.
Well, Joseph, let's do a follow-up on that comment by reading an excerpt of your book, The Machinery of Government, and here we go. I hope to have provided an alternative to the old civil service statement of duty, fearless advice, loyal implementation. This will no doubt remain a useful phrase to drop when politicians are in the room, but it dramatically understates the amount of raw power that is directly exercised by the civil service. Unfortunately, there has been something of a conspiracy of silence around this reality, between civil servants not wanting to be impolitic and academics enamored of highly idealized conceptions of democracy. I hate to sum up something as scholarly as your work in such a trite phrase, but you seem to be deeply concerned about the fact that the ideas that we've been talking about are hopelessly out of date, and the civil service today has not only taken unto itself, but also had downloaded to it, or maybe uploaded to it, from politicians, more responsibilities because politicians can't handle it anymore. Are we in trouble because of this, in your view?
Well, I think part of the reason that we're not in as much trouble as we might be with the decline of democracy and of public discourse is that we do have this fairly autonomous civil service that looks after many features of the business of government. So, I mean, what occasioned the writing of the book is this phenomenon that's sometimes described as the rise of the administrative state, or as they like to say in the United States, the deep state, right? So it's this idea that you have all these departments of government that are not really directly being controlled by elected officials. And that's, obviously the case. I mean, if you look at a portfolio like healthcare, so in Ontario, there's more than 500,000 people who are in one or another way government employees in the healthcare sector. And they're all under the supervision of the Minister of Health and Long-Term Care. But the thought that the minister is, involved in the fine detail of any of the management of these health organizations is obviously an illusion, right? So 500,000 people, that would make it a gigantic, I mean, even a corporation with a CEO who had been in the firm for 50 years would struggle to really exercise effective control over 500,000 employees. Mm-hmm. So it's clear that in the Ministry of Health, so the way the Ministry of Health runs is not only does it have a deputy minister, it has a half dozen associate ministers and assistant ministers, and it has doctors in various positions and so forth. I mean, there's a huge executive bureaucracy there, which often doesn't change from government to government. So the minister is exercising a kind of supervisory function. But in terms of who's running it, it's clearly the case that it's bureaucrats, unelected officials who are running the system. But that, of course, is a good thing because, on the other hand, if you were to have a government elected who sort of didn't care about healthcare and wasn't particularly interested in being in that business, nevertheless, the healthcare system would continue to function more or less the way it has been. Why? Because the government has really undertaken a commitment to the population to deliver healthcare. And that can't be subject to the kind of capricious whim that sometimes gets manifested in the results of democratic elections.
So the motto from days of yore of the civil service offering quote unquote fearless advice, but loyal implementation at the same time. Do you feel we're not in those times anymore?
Yeah, so I feel that that slogan doesn't exactly capture what the civil service does. And so it's a useful phrase, but I mean, none of it's wrong. Like they are supposed to offer fearless advice and they are supposed to offer loyal implementation. But they do more than that, which is that, first of all, they exercise an enormous amount of discretion, which means that a huge amount of what they do involves filling in the blanks and making decisions because law and ministerial directives are done at a very, very high level of abstraction. And so often a law will say something just along the lines of just kind of, do what's right. And then the interpretation of what's right gets left to the civil service. And that can't really be described as either advice. I mean, it's sort of implementation, but it's not really just implementation. They're making decisions. And then the second thing is that they have a lot of power and they have the capacity to push back against politicians. And the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the development of administrative law have been instrumental in that because courts have intervened with the growth of the administrative state. Courts have taken an increased interest in the way in which the administrative state carries out its responsibilities. And that has created a whole set of court decisions that constrain the way in which administration can be done. So that, along with other things, mean that when ministers sit down and say, I'd like to do this, often the answer from the civil service is, oh, no, you can't do that. Right. So that is kind of advice, but it's more than just advice. Like they're saying, like, you can't do that. And if the minister pushes it, they often say, well, we're not going to do that. But partly that's because they have very complex accountability relationships. They're not just accountable to the minister. In many cases, they're accountable to Parliament, but they're also accountable to the judiciary. They're accountable to various constituencies, administrative tribunals, and whatever. So there's a huge amount of complexity there that isn't really well captured by that slogan.
No, I appreciate that. But I also hear the other side of the coin, which is minister goes to deputy minister and says, I want to do this. And what traditionally happens is that the deputy says, all right, we'll go study it for a little while and come back to you with 3 options. And that's what happens. And then depending on how invested the minister is in the issue, she either picks option A, B, or C, or they don't do anything at all, whatever. Are you saying that's not the way it works anymore?
That's the way it works. But, well, I should say, I wasn't quite sure where you're going with initially, because sometimes when the minister says, oh, we're going to go and study it and come back with options, that's a way of obstructing an initiative. Which is
sometimes they don't come back at all.
Yeah, they don't come back and hope the minister forgets or that there's a new minister by the time the committee comes back or whatever, right? So that could go all kinds of ways. But one of the things that's happened as well, though, is that politicians have in many ways become less interested in governing. And I should say that that's the right now during the COVID pandemic is a bit of a state of exception to that, which is that elected officials very much have their eye on the ball with respect to the major issue and the emergency that's confronting our society. But if you think back to what politics was like 3 years ago, one of the things that politicians learned over the last 20 years was that just governing effectively and running the healthcare system, say, in a competent manner doesn't get you reelected. But increasingly, there's a very narrow set of wedge issues that become of interest to politicians because they've been told by their strategists that those are the issues on which votes hinge. And so increasingly, ministers are not interested in the entire portfolio, but rather are pursuing these kind of niche questions. So they're not likely to say, oh, give me 3 options on how to reduce wait times in the healthcare system. But they're more likely to say, I'm really interested in safe injection sites. And so I want you to do a bunch of briefs and, put together some data on, pro and con safe injection sites. Right. So I use this example because at the federal level, during the Harper government, there was Health Canada spent an enormous amount of time talking about safe injection sites. And the minister spent a huge amount of time talking about safe injection sites, not because that's an issue that's of enormous relevance to the health of Canadians. It's because polling showed that that was an issue on which people were willing to, votes were dependent upon that issue. It was a wedge issue, in other words. Paul Martin decided he wanted to tackle wait lists. He didn't exactly get a lot of credit for having done that. Why? Because that's one of these gigantic, slow-moving issues that affects millions of people, but only in the very long term, right? And so politicians increasingly are not interested in that kind of thing. And what they are interested in is, flashpoint stuff that gets people excited and upset, like, IV drug users getting free drugs from the government or something like that.
Right. Well, let me give you the most notorious example from Queen's Park, and admittedly, we're going back 30 years here, but Bob Rae became premier in 1990, and he discovered, and his ministers discovered, that he couldn't get any of his agenda through the bureaucracy because many of them were actively hostile to it. So he, in essence, replaced his own deputy minister, the secretary to cabinet, and put in, frankly, his former campaign manager, David Agnew, into that position. Because he said, if I don't have somebody who's like-minded to me moving this stuff through the bureaucracy, nothing is going to happen. Now, people had a heart attack at the time that this happened because they thought it was the mix of partisan political with what was supposed to be politically neutral. As you look at it, and given the broader context, was it problematic?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that. I'm a fan of civil service neutrality. I think it's a good institution. It's one worth preserving because it improves the quality of government. And I think that often people's tolerance for government involvement in various aspects of life is a function of what kind of experiences they have with government. And so quality of government is a public good that I think we should all be interested in preserving, and that requires a certain amount of professionalism. But it is important to recognize that if it doesn't work, so if the civil service becomes the check on it, right, is that if the civil service becomes too autonomous or becomes too obstructionist, then politicians can easily resolve that simply by replacing them with political staff. So you can either, replace them directly, or you can simply expand the number of political staff that you have in your office. You can assign new duties to your chief of staff and so forth, right? So it's not as though the system breaks down. It's that the balance between partisan loyalists and neutral civil servants shifts depending upon how well the civil service behaves. So I think it's important that the civil service reflect upon, in a more sophisticated and mature way, exactly what it is committed to with respect to neutrality and what it's not committed to with respect to neutrality, to get greater clarity on those issues, so that they know more clearly when they're crossing the line and when they're not crossing the line. So a slogan like fearless advice, loyal implementation doesn't really give people useful advice on when they're crossing the line. So what I'm trying to do in the book is to articulate more, where it's legitimate for the civil service to have a view and when it's not legitimate for the civil service to have a view on a particular question. I think it's important that we think harder and more about that so that we can maintain this high quality professional civil service. But the worst case scenario is that politicians do what Bob Rae did and what lots of, I'm from Saskatchewan. It's what the Grant Devine did when he came in. He fired all the deputy ministers because his assumption was just they're a bunch of NDP stalwarts, and so I have to get rid of all of them.
It's funny, when David Peterson took over, and we're going back 36 years now, he assumed after 42 years of Tories in Ontario that he was going to have to fire all the deputy ministers because he thought they were all true blue. And he discovered within 6 months' time that they're actually pretty professional and they were happy to do their jobs regardless of which political party was in power. And that was a happy revelation for him. But I wonder what happens to that public service when a group of populists take over and whether that changes the relationship at all.
Well, so populism is, has a lot of different definitions, but often populism is a political movement that tends not to respect a lot of the traditional constraints of liberalism. And that includes the separation of powers. So, for example, like talking about unelected judges is a classic kind of populist phrase. And it's designed to kind of delegitimize the judiciary and the courts. When you think about it, it's sort of a nonsensical phrase, like unelected judges. Like every judge in Canada is unelected. Like so. But what it means is that they're sort of casting aspersions on any source of political power that doesn't have democratic legitimacy and election to justify it. So unelected courts. Well, populists also tend to be very, very suspicious of powerful civil servants who, in the permanent civil service, also have not been elected. So, for example, central banking has historically been a big flashpoint and source of opposition in populist movements in Canada. Where, like, why does the governor of the Bank of Canada get to set interest rates? I mean, the governor of the Bank of Canada is an incredibly powerful figure and makes an enormous number of decisions that have a huge impact on the life of Canadians, but the governor is not elected. So populists tend to be suspicious of those forms of power. That unfortunately tends to come back to bite them in many ways, because I mean, so one of the Achilles heel of many illiberal democracies, like say Turkey right now, is that they often undermine their own currency because they don't respect central bank independence, and the people tend to have particular preferences with respect to monetary policy, like that interest rates should always be low, that often can lead to economic disaster. So in a healthy democracy, it's important to recognize that there are many counter-majoritarian institutions, and not only do the courts often push back against the legislature, but the executive, right, or the public service also often pushes back against the legislature. So the governor of the Bank of Canada, in many ways, is just as independent as a Supreme Court justice, and both of them have an obligation at times to resist what the legislature is telling them to do. Now, at the end of the day, Parliament gets to decide, but that doesn't mean that everybody just rolls over and plays dead as soon as an elected official starts telling them what to do.
Gotcha. Joseph, I have time left enough to congratulate you for being nominated for the Donner Prize, which is the best book on public policy by a Canadian. It's going to be awarded in May. And of course, we're scrupulously neutral on this program, but we're delighted that you got a nomination for that, for the machinery of government. And thanks for coming on to TVO tonight and talking to us about it.
Well, thank you very much as well.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.